As you know, most of you, I love to go walking, and I was walking recently in the Cotswold, a beautiful walk, and at the moment I have a particular worship song on my mind, and I was enjoying this song, singing through the words. It's a communion song by Matt Redman, and as I was singing through the chorus, remembrance leads us to worship, and as we worship, our worship leads to communion. And not long before that, I had asked God to show me what the subject of this particular sermon should be. And as I was singing that song and singing that particular refrain, that word worship came into my mind, and I felt that this sermon should be on that topic of worship. I felt God very much challenged me to talk about worship, and eventually I thought about a lovely passage in John chapter 4. And now we're going to have a Bible reading from verse 4 to verse 29. And this week, the reading actually was done on location.
Today's reading is John chapter 4, verses 4 to 29. He had to go through Samaria on the way. Eventually, he came to the Samaritan village of Sychar, near the field that Jacob gave his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired from the long walk, sat wearily beside the well at about noontime. Soon a Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Please, give me a drink." He was alone at the time because the disciples had gone into the village to buy some food. The woman was surprised, for Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. "You are a Jew and I am a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink?"
If you only knew the gift God has for you and who you are speaking to, you would ask me, and I would give you living water.
"But sir, you don't have a rope or a bucket, and this well is very deep. Where would you get this living water? And besides, do you think you're greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us this well? How can you offer better water than he and his sons and his animals enjoyed?"
Anyone who drinks this water will soon become thirsty again, but those who drink the water I give will never be thirsty again. It becomes a fresh, bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life.
"Please, sir, give me this water. Then I'll never be thirsty again, and I won't have to come here to get water."
Go get your husband.
"I don't have a husband."
You're right, you don't have a husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and you aren't even married to the man you're living with now. You certainly spoke the truth.
"Sir, you must be a prophet. So tell me, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship, while we Samaritans claim it is here, at Mount Gerizim, where our ancestors worshipped?"
Believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans know very little about the one you worship, while we Jews know all about him, for salvation comes through the Jews. But the time is coming, indeed, it's here now, when true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him that way. For God is spirit, so those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth.
"I know the Messiah is coming, the one who is called Christ. When he comes, he will explain everything to us."
I am the Messiah.
Just then, the disciples came back. They were shocked to find him talking to a woman, but none of them had the nerve to ask, "What do you want with her?" or "Why are you talking to her?" The woman left her water jar beside the well and ran back to the village, telling everyone, "Come and see the man who told me everything I ever did. Could he possibly be the Messiah?"
Okay, so there we have it. Interesting meeting between Jesus and a certain Samaritan woman. And I want to talk about this woman. I want to talk about her life before she encountered Jesus. I want to talk about her a little bit. We're given information in the passage. And first of all, I want to talk about her routine, because her routine was frustrating. Her routine was frustrating. "Sir," she said to Jesus, "give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." You get the impression she was sick of this daily routine, having to bring her water jar, fill it up with water, and then carrying a water jar that had become very heavy back to her home. What's more, she was coming evidently at the hottest time of the day. Why do you suppose she was doing that? Well, from what we know about her, it's likely that she was coming around noon in order to avoid other people. She knew that it was most likely that she would be there on her own. So to avoid people, she made her life more inconvenient than it needed to be to come at this very hot time of the day to get her water from the well. So her routine was frustrating, there's no doubt about that. There was a farmer who once said about milking cows that the hardest thing about milking cows is that they never stay milked. The hardest thing about milking cows is that they never stay milked. It's very obvious if you think about it, but it's a sign. But his routine was somewhat frustrating, and it could be true for you. Many people find their daily routines a little bit difficult to maintain, a bit tedious, a bit boring, same thing day in, day out. Well, let me tell you, as Christians, there's no guarantee that our routines won't be frustrating, but it certainly helps a lot if God is at the centre of our lives. Unless your life is controlled by God, it will lack meaning. When God is in charge of your life, even the most tedious, mundane things can be done with a new attitude of giving them as part of our worship to God. We can do these things as an offering to Him and do them the best we can for His glory. So, before this woman encountered Jesus, her routine was frustrating. And we know also from what she said to Jesus that her relationships were fragile. Her relationships were fragile because Jesus says to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is you've had 5 husbands. 5 husbands. And the man you now have is not your husband." It's quite clear for this woman that every Mr. Right turned out in the end to be Mr. Wrong. Another story for you. A man called Joe, when he was down the pub, he said to his mate about his mother-in-law. People sometimes talk about their mothers-in-law, not often in a flattering way perhaps. Well, on this particular occasion, in this conversation, he said to his mate, "Actually, my mother-in-law and I have a lot in common. We both wish my wife had married somebody else." So, many people think that life is about finding the right partner. And if you've got the wrong partner, you get rid of the wrong partner and you find the right partner. And many people have this ideal, this thought that if only they could find the right partner, that the emptiness in their life would evaporate. Well, I have to say to you, as someone who loves God and who tries to follow Him, that I have discovered that actually, if you have emptiness in your life, that the key issue is to have a strong relationship with God. Everything else will fall into place after that. The key issue is to have a strong relationship with God. For this woman, her relationships were fragile, but she was looking for answers in the wrong places. And gloriously for her on that occasion, she bumped into Jesus, who just happened to be there. I don't think that. I think it was a divine appointment. I think that Jesus actually deliberately took that route in order to meet this particular woman. So let's continue to talk about the woman. Her routine was frustrating, her relationships were fragile, and her religion was fruitless. Why do I say that? Well, in the passage, she starts talking about worship. She says our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, But you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. Why did she say that? Well, I think partly she raised this point to change the subject because Jesus was beginning to get quite personal, talking to her about her love life, about her past relationships, about her present relationship. She was embarrassed. She wanted to change the subject, so she asked this question. She perceived that Jesus was a religious man, so she asked this question, partly to change the subject, and maybe partly because she knew she wasn't right with God. And she was beginning to be more and more impressed with this stranger, that evidently he wasn't there to chat her up, but he was there actually genuinely to talk to her about important matters. Her religion was fruitless, and she starts talking about religion. She starts talking about the location of worship. She hoped perhaps that one day she would meet the Messiah, and that the Messiah would show her how she could satisfy her spiritual thirst. And all her hopes came true that day, because she did meet the Messiah. She didn't realise at first. And actually Jesus would show her how to satisfy her spiritual thirst. In fact, early on in the conversation, Jesus started talking about living water, and she didn't know what he was talking about. Jesus offered her living water. So before she met Jesus, her routine was frustrating, her relationships were fragile, her religion was fruitless. But everything changed that day for this woman. We thought about what her life was like before she encountered Jesus. Well, let's think about how things were about to change after she encountered Jesus. Because that day she learned an important lesson about worship. That worship is about a person. Worship is about a person. Jesus answered, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. Living water. And what Jesus was talking about when he referred to living water is that inner fountain of bubbling vitality and joy, which is only possible as we experience life in the Holy Spirit. That's what Jesus was talking about. And the woman that day learned that worship is about a person. And following on from her question, she learned that worship is not about a place. It's not about a place. Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. Because worship is not to do with being on the right mountain or being in the right temple or in the right building. The good news today for you listening to this message is that you can worship God anywhere. Did you know that? You can worship God anywhere. So the woman learned that lesson that day, that worship is not about a place. And the other lesson she learned, perhaps the most important lesson of all, is this. She learned that she could worship God from her head and from her heart. From her head and from her heart. Jesus said to her, the time is coming when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. True worshippers worship God in spirit and in truth. That's what she needed to hear. That's perhaps what you need to hear today. This is what worship is all about. Worshipping God in spirit and in truth. From the head and from the heart. When we worship God in spirit, we worship him from the heart, as led by the Holy Spirit of God. Do you worship God in that way? Would you like to? Well, you can. It's the best way, the purest way to worship God. To worship God in spirit. But that's not the complete phrase. The time is coming, Jesus said, when true worshippers will worship in spirit and in truth. In truth. We worship God in truth. In this postmodern age, we're encouraged to make up our own truth. And we can have our own individual truth. And no one's allowed to deny us that right. And everyone can have their own truth. And a lot of it is just made up truth. Well, what truth is that? Do we not believe in absolute truth anymore? That some things are intrinsically true and some things are intrinsically false? Well, I hope you do. That there is such a thing still in this postmodern age as absolute truth. The Bible is full of absolute truth. And when Jesus said to the woman, you need to worship the Father in spirit and in truth, he was saying you don't only worship God from the heart, you don't only worship God in spirit, but in truth. In truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life, Jesus said on another occasion. You need to worship God in truth, through your head, through your mind, to think about the truths of God, which are revealed in his word, within the Bible, within a glorious chapter like this one, in John chapter 4. I hope you aspire today, as you listen to this message, to worship God in spirit and in truth. I hope you do. Some people have posed the question, while we've been in lockdown, whether it's harder to worship God in lockdown. Well, I would answer a question with a question. Why should it be? Why should it be harder to worship God in lockdown than it was before, when life was different, when life was much more normal? Why should it be harder? And again, you might want to come back to me with an answer. It's harder because we're not in the church building. Well, if you say that, do you know what you're doing? You're going on a journey back, actually, into the days of the Old Testament. That's what you're doing. That's Old Testament worship. And those of you at Meredith Road, you may remember that we looked at Psalm 42, and we looked at Psalm 43, and we looked at Psalm 84. And in those three Psalms, we come across a chap who was very musical, but was in a lockdown of his own, far from Jerusalem, far from the temple there, where he loved to worship God. And for him, with his limited understanding of worship, he felt that there was something vital missing in not being able to worship God in the temple, in the appropriate place. Well, many of us are missing the church building at Meredith Road, but let me tell you, your worship should not be depleted simply because you're now having to worship God away from that building. There's nothing special about that building in terms of our ability to worship God. So I want to say to that question, is it harder to worship God in lockdown? It shouldn't be. Certainly not if we're saying because we're not in the church building. That is Old Testament religion, and you want to avoid that kind of thinking. But then another reason why people say it's harder to worship God in lockdown is because we tend to have all of our times together online, via Zoom. And some people have said, well, it's harder to worship God in these circumstances because it's more difficult for us to sing worship songs on Zoom. And it is a bit harder because essentially it feels like we're singing on our own because we have to mute all the mics because it doesn't work out, does it? We've discovered that. And we end up just singing with the worship leader or with the backing track. Does that make it harder to worship? Well, it depends how you view worship. Obviously, part of worship is singing songs to God. However, we can sing songs to God in all kinds of different ways. You can sing on your own. We've got so many resources. And actually, at the end of the day, worship is a lot more than singing. Of course, it's part of it. And the Bible is full of examples of people who came to God in praise and thanksgiving and adoration using the medium of music to worship God. So I don't deny that it is part of worship. But ultimately, my friends, you need to get this truth. True worship is an offering. It's an offering of ourselves. It's an offering of our bodies. It's an offering of our money. It's an offering of our time. It's an offering of our talents to God for him to use. Is that kind of worship harder in lockdown? Why should it be? So today, make it your resolve that you're going to worship God. And you're not going to buy into this lie that it's so much harder in these circumstances to worship God. We need to give ourselves to him. We need to commit totally to him. We need to give ourselves as an offering to him. Will you do that today? Will you respond to this message, to God's words to you, to worship him? He longs for you to worship him much more than you ever desire to come before him and offer yourself to him. Would you satisfy him? Come to him and worship him today, please. Thank you for listening. God bless you.